Good evening. I'm Eric Lee, Director of the Kimbell Art Museum, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the Kimbell once again the distinguished scholar, Mary Miller, who is one of the world's foremost authorities on the art of the ancient New World. Since 2019, she has been director of the Getty Research Institute. Before that, she had a long career at Yale, arriving as a graduate student in the 1970s after her undergraduate years at Princeton and rising to Yale's highest academic rank, Sterling Professor of History of Art. From 2008 to 14, Professor Miller was Dean of Yale College. Her other administrative posts at Yale include serving from 2016 through 2018 as Senior Director of the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage on Yale's West Campus. In that capacity, she advanced the sustainable care, study, and use of the world's cultural heritage through multidisciplinary research, innovation in technology and conservation practice, education, and advocacy. Professor Miller is also recognized for her curatorial expertise. In 2004, she was co-curator of the exhibition, The Courtly Art of the Ancient Maya, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And in 1986, was co-curator with Linda Sheila of the Kimbell exhibition, The Blood of Kings. At the Kimbell, we consider The Blood of Kings to be one of the most important and groundbreaking exhibitions in the Kimbell's history. For both of the aforementioned shows, Professor Miller co-wrote the catalogs, and among her many other books are The Murals of Bonampak, The Art of Mesoamerica, which is now in its 6th edition, Maya Art and Architecture with Megan O'Neill, The Gods and Symbols of Ancient Mexico and the Maya with Carl Taub, and A Pre-Columbian World co-edited with Jeffrey Quilter. With Barbara Mundy, Professor Miller edited Painting a Map of Mexico City, a study of the rare indigenous map in Yale's Beinecke Library. And with Claudia Brittenham, she wrote The Spectacle of the Late Maya Court, Reflections on the Murals of Bonampak. For her work on ancient Mexico and the Maya, Professor Miller has won national recognition, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Getty Grant. In 1994, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2016 to 17, she was a National Phi Beta Kappa lecturer. In 2010, she delivered the 59th Andrew W. Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art, and in 2015, the Slade Lectures at Cambridge University. The Mellon and Slade Lectures are widely considered to be the most prestigious lectures in the field of art history. I've known Mary Miller since I was a student at Yale, and through the years at the Kimbell, we have consulted with her on matters Mesoamerican, including most recently the acquisition of the Olmec Jade standing figure holding a were-jaguar baby. Her advice and expertise were critical as we navigated the Jade's acquisition, and for this I am so grateful. Please welcome Mary Miller as she speaks tonight on the Kimbell's Olmec standing figure holding a were-jaguar baby.
Thank you so much for those warm words, Eric. Am I wired? Is everyone hearing me clearly and correctly? Great. Coming back to the Kimbell, I am so struck by the fact that it was this institution in 1984 that decided to take a chance on 2 assistant professors, Linda Sheely at Texas, me at Yale, and think, working with Emily Sano, who was such a great curator here, to take this chance on really framing a new narrative of Maya art. It wasn't that it was totally new in the world, but it was new for the public. And it was an incredible opportunity, and I am so grateful to this institution for having that faith in me. One of the things that I am aware of as I reach, gosh, when Eric reads that long list of everything I've done, I think, oh my God, I'm still standing. I've been very fortunate to work with the institutions I've worked with through time. And I am grateful for their support because I know they amplify my work. And this is one of those institutions. Now, you're here tonight with me, and I'm going to switch this to my holding side. But I just want to be sure that you're all aware that tonight is the night of the Parade of Planets, in which all the planets that can ever be seen by the naked eye in the sky are actually all going to be visible in about 45 minutes. So if you feel the urge to run to your car and get to a place where you can see the planets, I completely understand. And the other thing I would just say that in Mesoamerican terms, this is probably a really dangerous moment. So if you also want to run to your car because you're very concerned about bad omens, there's another reason. But if you go, you will be missing a treat. And the treat is not me, but the breathtaking beauty of the object that we're about to look at. So sit a spell. And I would ask, I'm going to not say a few words. I'm going to say no words for a few slides. And I want you to look, and look with me. Were they wearing clothing? When I come back to a slide, now think about dressing this figure. Proportions. How is it made? How much pre-Hispanic art is there in the world? I'm going to run through a whole bunch of slides, and I'm not really going to talk about them. I just want you to see that in museum after museum, in the United States, in Europe, I don't include Israel, they have a lot as well in this run-through. There's me, back at Yale. There's a lot of pre-Hispanic art in the world. This is Penn's relatively new installation. You'll notice that there are a lot of things made of green stone, ceramic, stucco, and heavy, dark volcanic rocks, as well as limestone. Here's Houston. And then here's the Houston Museum of Science. They have a vast collection too. Denver. Art Institute of Chicago. MFA Boston. Quai Branly in Paris. The Gilcrease, Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're doing a reinstallation right now. Cleveland, an amazing collection in Cleveland. And I'm showing you here as well the provenance sources for where these, how these objects were acquired. Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. It was a big single collection that was acquired there in 1961. And let's linger for a second on the American Museum of Natural History. These are slides I took 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago when I was in New York for College Art Association. It is one of the great collections of Olmec art with this great hot scarlet or carmine, what would I call that shade of red and orange? I'll have to ask George Shackelford afterwards. Including the item over here on the far right, which was actually found in Puebla in 1905. The very large figure we're going to come back to eventually in this talk. So how much is there? And how many objects are there? And I give you the numbers that have been thrown about for African art, documented by Bénédicte Savoie. I think it's interesting to look at these numbers. The numbers for pre-Hispanic collections are nothing like the numbers for collections of African art in Europe. Still, it's an interesting thing to ask ourselves. So what was happening? How does pre-Columbian art survive? How does pre-Hispanic art survive that first 100 years of the Spanish invasion? And the truth is, it's tough for objects to survive. Anything that is made of a precious metal is melted right down. So you're seeing here cute little birds or turtles. These things are simply turned into works, into raw metal to be repurposed by the Spanish crown. Sometimes objects survive, like this Olmec mask, a late Olmec mask, that survives in a Rococo setting in the Schatzkammer in Munich. No one knows how it got there. And the arms are actually made of a green ceramic to match the green jade head. Other objects, this is a particular favorite of mine, where Aztec feathered serpents get recarved into things like baptismal fonts. As we've ended the year of the dragon, but we're now in the year of the snake, perhaps this is particularly appropriate this year. Books, sacred books, were either burned or taken as curiosities. And many had also had their, what seemed to be idolatrous or sacred information scraped off them in order not to be put to the torch. And the single most valuable materials of the pre-Hispanic world were almost certainly jade and feathers. And when these things survive, it is partly jade because it is so hard, or feathers because they were curiosities that could be taken to Europe. So in the long 19th century, there are collections that are made, that are lost, that are documented. And this is where we really begin to take on the story of the Kimbell jade tonight. Here we are in Mexico City, and the arrow is pointing to where the calendar stone roughly was excavated. And we look at this because things are being collected and taken to the cathedral, and they're being put a little bit like spolia, the way Romans put the conquered peoples and conquered gods on their buildings and took them over. It's a little bit like that when we see the calendar stone on the exterior of the cathedral. And there were other things that were being brought there as well. And there were collections that were being made. Perhaps one of the greatest was being made by John Lloyd Stevens, the first ambassador to the Federation of Central America, which did not include Mexico, but included everything between Colombia and Mexico. And he made a vast collection about which we know almost nothing because it was here. It was in the old Smithsonian Castle, and it burned in 1865. We know nothing about the collection because that's where his documents about the collection also were, when the building was torched or burned down of its own volition. Question for another day. There were objects that were being collected in the years right after independence from Spain. And one of the first people to make a collection to take to Europe, including casts, as you can see here, in Piccadilly in 1824, was this guy, Mr. William Bullock. And he took objects as well as casts of real things. And then, anyone who's interested in fire-breathing dragons will have to say that thing over there on the left is surely a figment of someone's imagination, and it was not of the ancient Mesoamerican people. So what do we know about the collections made in the 19th century? And it turns out that inadvertently, I started working on this question in 2015. So just a decade ago, I started working on the question that I think will be answered tonight, but I didn't know what the question was. And I got very interested in Ambassador Poinsett. Wasn't his title, he was the minister plenipotentiary or something, but he was the first representative of the American government to the Mexican government after Mexican independence from Spain. Now we have to remember, what did Mexico consist of? New Spain. Mexico was all of New Spain. That is, we are standing in New Spain tonight. We are standing in what was Mexico briefly tonight, as we always are when I am in California. And Ambassador Poinsett was very interested in making collections, as were the other ambassadors from Europe at the time. Now, we know Poinsett best for his name, because he decided to name this plant that bloomed at Christmas. It would turn out to be named the poinsettia. And he was going to be recalled to the United States by the Jackson presidency because the president of Mexico was furious with him. He was furious with Poinsett because Poinsett had this plan that he would buy Texas, the province of Texas, for the United States. And why was this an important thing for him to do? The president of Mexico in 1829, when this call for him to be expelled from Mexico and recalled to the United States came through, was Mexico's only black president, Vicente Guerrero, and he had declared that slavery had come to an end in Mexico. And this was very tough in the part of Mexico that was Texas in the time, because of the plantations, cotton, and the need for enslaved labor. So it didn't work out for Poinsett. I will let you all reminisce and remember what happens in 1836. But just to say, there was a plan for it earlier. Now, Poinsett was one of a number of ambassadors who were in Mexico City. And Mexico City in mid-1820s was not a place where there were any embassies. And they really even had no housing for strangers. There was ecclesiastical housing, there were houses for wealthy people, there were houses for poor servants, but it had not been a market economy for housing. So it turns out that there were a number of people who lived together in one large house. You will forgive me, since as far as I've been able to track down, they were all male. You will forgive me for calling it the frat house. And in the frat house, we have Ambassador Poinsett, and just also to say it's a little tricky having these Protestants in the mix in a Catholic country. Protestants had been forbidden from visiting New Spain, so only after independence are any Protestants allowed into the country. Poinsett, we have the Swiss ambassador, Lucas Vischer. He is there as well. And we have this amazing artist named Maximilian Frank. He too is living in the frat house. And Maximilian Franck, who is a really skilled draftsman, makes a catalog that he hopes to publish, but which he is unable to do. He dies in 1831, I think. He makes this catalog, and it survives today in the British Museum, in the library of the British Museum. And this is the picture I took of it when I was there in the fall of 23. I'd looked at this carefully before, but I really I'm looking at it through a glassine sleeve. And you can see that the ink has run, but it's the description, page by page, of the collection of the drawings of Mexican antiquities. So it tells us exactly what objects were in Mexico City in 1829, 1828, and by 1830, Franck has left Mexico City and gone to Philadelphia, where in fact his buddy, the American ambassador, is now living, as are some mining engineers who are also living in the frat house. The objects in this amazing catalog have quite interesting life stories. So here's one that's in Berlin. His drawings are so accurate that we have no doubt about tracking object by object. And a number of them stay in Mexico City. Here's one. There I was in 2015. Once again, I was in Zurich looking at the collections, and here's this very object. And it turns out it was Ambassador Lucas Vischer who took this back from Mexico at the end of his time in Mexico City. So where did the ambassadors live? And you can see on this map, I've highlighted where the cathedral is, and they were living in a compound known as San Agustin. So very close to the cathedral. You can see it is a short walk on muddy streets with open sewers. Not really a pleasant walk, but they are close to the cathedral. And here you get a slightly better sense of it today. These buildings no longer exist. They were replaced in the 19th century, and then again, late 19th century, and then again in the 20th century. So nothing remains of it. As I am not the first to notice, and on page 17 of the Franck album, there is a pencil drawing that was added, seems to be added at a later date. And it is this drawing where you can see on the left-hand side, you can see the sketch in pencil that Maximilian Franck has made of the very amazing Kimbell jade. And what does he say about page 17? He says, this is a group representing a mother with her child, a rare subject in American art. So he knows, he's seen everything that there is to see in this time period. Its color is a clear green, a rare beauty of workmanship, very fine and polished. So he sees it. 1829, where did it come from? Now, so most of the objects that are in the Franck album, almost all of them probably come within about 100 kilometers of Mexico City, if not from within the confines of Mexico City itself. We know that many of the objects that were collected over the course of the 19th century came from this region without much being drawn from Oaxaca or from the Gulf Coast, which we might think of as the home of Olmec art. So it is probably from this area, and it is very likely that it was in the hands of someone at the cathedral itself. And one of the reasons why this was also the case, because not only was the cathedral the place where the spolia of the past were being displayed, but where the most important and dangerous sculpture that had been excavated in the late period of the Spanish presence in Mexico, the sculpture that we call the Coatlicue, was found to be so dangerous that they had to rebury her And they buried her actually in the vestibule of the cathedral so that she could be contained. This suggests that there's a little anxiety still circulating around the cathedral about, and in the highest levels of clerics, about these works that might support or engender some kind of idolatrous practice or behavior. So one of the other very interesting parts of this story is because although it is possible that the Jade goes to Philadelphia with Franck or with Poinsett, it does not enter the collections of the American Philosophical Society. And I went back and looked at their records again in January of 24. It's really hard to tell exactly what Keating and Poinsett, Keating the mining engineer, what they put on deposit, but there is no record of anything like this extraordinary object. It may be that if Poinsett had his hands on it, he never wanted to take them off. It is that kind of object. And then, of course, we have all, and to fast forward to the next line of the story, this object is going to be in France when it comes back to the United States. That's a teaser. We're coming to that point. But just to say that we often forget in our American history that while the United States was involved in a bloody civil war, the French said, oh yeah, we always wanted to own Mexico. Let's go, guys. And so for 5 years, Mexico sends Maximilian, the brother of the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, send Maximilian and his wife Carlotta, maybe you saw the movie, with Betty Davis as Carlotta. She's pretty unforgettable. But there was a great deal of always interest in Mexico in France. And years later, in 1908, when the Mexican dictator is forced to flee the country, Porfirio Diaz, where does he go? He certainly does not go to the United States. It is he, after all, who has said, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. So where does he go? He goes to France. And he's allowed to take his entire collection with him. And we know that he had a big collection because those objects turn up at auction periodically with that incredible provenance that they belonged to Porfirio Diaz. So the Jade, at some point, is going to go to France. So there are lots of other things that are going on with France. One is that Maximilian has this idea that he would actually like to repatriate things from the colonial moment and return them to Mexico and build a big museum. He does, in fact, return this important feather object, but he is perhaps Maximilian, although his story is not well known by almost anyone. He is best remembered by the paintings that Edouard Manet made of his being gunned down when he was executed by the troops of Juarez in 1867. There's always been a kind of continuing French interest in Mexico. Augustus Le Plongeon came from France and did kind of wacky excavations at Chichen Itza back in the late 19th century. He made some amazing discoveries, he also said they were from 100,000 years ago. So he had a rough time with chronology. And after the restoration of Mexico's own presidency, they worked to grow a national museum. And with works, the Hall of Monoliths, as it was known, and bringing things from across the nation. So they do figure out a way to have a museum in Mexico in this period. Archaeology does get going in fits and starts. One of the things that happens is that based on an important document that has been rediscovered by a French abbé, again, the French looking for things about Mexico in their own archives, published in French an account of the 16th century, which said that if there's treasure to be found in this land, it should be in the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. Doesn't quite say that, but close enough. So the American honorary consul decides to dredge it, finding all kinds of things that begin to whet the appetite for knowing more about that pre-Hispanic past, and including really what's never been really understood very clearly about the things in the cenote is that they were all burned. So it was a place where things were being burned and thrown into the water. You can imagine the kind of sizzle of jade snapping apart. And the single greatest quantity of things found in the Chichen Itza cenote are, on the one hand, copper bells, so they would have been making sound as they went into the water, but secondarily, jade. And jade that was burned, it was burning hot when it hit the water, and it shattered into pieces. We learned from an Aztec poem written down in European alphabet after the Spanish invasion. We learn that, in fact, when jade breaks, when feathers crumble to dust, that is the end of life. And so there were times when jade broke, feathers turned to dust, things were on fire. In Mexico City, meanwhile, at the same period of time, at the same time that they're dredging the cenote, people get interested in archaeology. And they have already taken the calendar stone off the cathedral, moved it to a museum. They put in a sewer, and they discover a ton of stuff, giving indication of a powerful Aztec presence that they thought they had buried under monumental colonial structures. Over the course of the 20th century, that Aztec past will be revealed. And the same Porfirio Diaz had this idea, although by this time he's in France, on the run, getting to take his entire collection with him. By 1910, Mexico has really begun to celebrate their centenary of independence from Spain. They've got 100 years of it now under their belts. They've lost 1/3 of their country to the United States, first Texas, and then the rest of northern New Spain, California, etc., Arizona, New Mexico. And you can see the narrow gauge railroad, which is bringing tourists finally out from Mexico City. And they are beginning to reconstruct monumental architecture, to build tourism, and to carry out a little bit more systematic of excavations. And one of the things that turns up here in a context we do not know is one of the most important jades, a jade that had to have been made about 750 miles at the very minimum away from this place. So it was a movable, portable object. This jade turns up at Teotihuacan, and then it travels all over Mexico and Belize before finally finding a buyer in the British Museum today. But I have it on the screen because I want you to look at, that is not my hairy arm, but here, again, in the fall of 23, in the British Museum, looking at the back of the object. And you can see, you look at the front of it, you think, well, what happened? Did it break? Or did someone systematically cut off little pieces of this jade? Did it have drill holes that didn't go through? Where are these holes going? And were there other cuts that they were trying to make? Well, the answer is probably yes to all of those things. and to get a sense of how this works as an object. And we find ourselves suddenly beginning to ask the questions, who were the Olmec? So it is around this time, early in the 20th century, reconstructing buildings at Teotihuacan, about 20 miles outside of Mexico City, finding the Aztec temple through the sewer excavation near the cathedral in Mexico City, finding jade and gold in the Mayas, in the cenote at Chichen Itza. And this idea that there's beginning to be an organized narrative of the past, that Mexico's pastness is beginning to fall into some kind of script in which you can see, as people thought, it all begins with the Maya. Hold that thought. And then you get these later cultures, and they're really never quite as good again. So it was into this seemingly organized view of the pre-Hispanic past of Mexico that then a monkey wrench is thrown, or shall I say, a colossal head. Oh, or jade. So the Olmec, the past of the Olmec, begin to be revealed in the tropical rainforest along the Gulf of Veracruz, which makes it it's difficult terrain, and oil hasn't been discovered there yet. Oil will be discovered there pretty soon. And we don't have radiocarbon to offer absolute dating, any kind of scientific method for dating. So people really wrestle about what is going on. Who made these big heads? And as objects begin to surface, many of them portable, there begins to be the sense that there was, perhaps, it starts out at the very beginning. And let me just tell you, okay, I'm a Mayanist, but let me just tell you, those Mayanists dug their heels in, and they were not going to be dislodged from being the primary culture of ancient Mexico. Kicking and screaming, they went. Radiocarbon will eventually seal the deal. But people begin to notice that there is a whole cohort of things that seem to be related. And we're back at the Natural History Museum in New York, and what I want you to see is very hard to find pictures of it, the back of the object. This is a big thing. This is the biggest Olmec jade we know of, and it was acquired. It was seemingly in circulation, maybe a little bit like the Kimbell jade had always been treasured, never, ever going into a permanent ground burial location. Things we don't know. But this was acquired, the Kuntz axe, as it is known, by Mr. Kuntz. And who was Mr. Kuntz? He was the specialist in what was called non-precious stones for the nascent, kind of small, modest jewelry store in New York City known as Tiffany. And he was looking for something that could go into mass production and would be readily available, and you could get a lot of it. And of course, we now know that would turn out to be robin's egg blue turquoise, which that would be the stone he would land on as his signature. But he made this huge collection. Eventually, it would go to natural history. And this was an object that he acquired in Oaxaca City in the late 19th century. And he was absolutely absorbed with this object. And I want you to look at it and see that its figure is all head. It's like a colossal head holding onto something so tight in front of him and in the shape of a ceremonial axe and with a body so compressed, it's almost as though it's mummified and wrapped up, and all these cuts across the back of it. Someone wanted a piece of it, and only a few people actually got a piece of it. That is the kind of object with this snarling mouth, these almond eyes, and a particular set of proportions, subject matter. And the jade of the Olmec is always this beautiful blue-green translucent jade. And the Maya, who love jade too, like this apple green color over here. Actually, it's much rarer, but to my eye, actually also not as luminous or in some ways full of life. The way the Olmec did their work, whether it was a colossal head, and there are colossal heads that have been found at principally 4 sites, and the great preponderance of them found at one site, San Lorenzo, and a number of them also at La Venta. You know, one of them spent most of a season sitting in front of the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. If any of you were there in the 60s, as my colleague Rex Kuntz told me about a few months ago. But this is the technique of making Olmec art is consistent, whether it is monumental or handheld. And this drilling, because jade is the hardest stone that is found in the Mesoamerican world. And you can say, well, it's jadeite, is it not as good as nephrite? Nephrite, jadeite, they have the same mineral components. Jadeite is found in the New World, nephrite is found in Asia, and they are both true jades. And that to drill it in Mesoamerica, you had to use handheld drills like this and use jade powder in order to create the forms. It is incredibly difficult work. And then you polished it with leather. Leather probably was some kind of, a little bit of some sort of animal fat. There are very few fats and very few animals that yield fat in Mesoamerica, maybe a little avocado oil to keep trying to get this surface absolutely smooth. And that is the thing that the Olmec did better than any other people of the ancient world. These colossal heads, and they are truly colossal, and people keep finding them. They in heavy rain and in near riverbeds, and we find that many of them, and the earliest ones, often adhere to really amazing proportional control. And I'm asking you, when we think about the Kimbell jade, to think about the control of the making, of the proportions. Once you make one of those drill holes, or once the thing begins to shatter, there is no going back. So this is a work, as we look at the Kimbell jade, that takes us to incredible mastery. Now, a number of these jades, here's La Venta offering 4, are found when they have been found archaeologically. They are found in groupings. And this is, you see, offering 4 from La Venta, and it's easy to imagine that something like the Dumbarton Oaks one came, that was acquired in 1911 or so, also purchased in Paris, I think, that there was it was once part of such a group, and perhaps many of them were clothed. They would have had on fine, silky, refined cotton. We see that many of them have holes for earrings to wear, and they may have had headdresses. In fact, these strongly shaped heads perhaps make it a little easier to put the headdress and sustain it on these figures. All of this is supposition, but it's one that I think something like a work like this one, which is the great Las Limas figure, which was found after villagers found it, they put it in a shrine because they realized that it was a miraculous appearance of the Virgin Mary with Christ. Now remember, what did Maximilian Franck say? He said that this was a mother with her child, the Kimbell jade. And we see that the strong, downturned mouth, the supernatural face of the baby, and the human, kind face, sober, unemotional, though, is of the larger figure. We often see these figures in motion. One of the greatest of all is the wrestler at the National Museum in Mexico City. And this carrying of babies is also present on La Venta Altar 5. And so badly beaten, damaged through time, ritually terminated. And as we look at it, we can see that in this case, it seems once again almost to be a dead baby it's limp, it's lifeless, being carried in the arms of the central figure, and the baby's being carried by the human figures on the side, who seem to be very much supernatural, are rambunctious, cannot be controlled, are trying to get out of the arms of these humans who are carrying them. This one kind of got a hand up, and I feel like I know a baby who could rip an earring right out of. So these are subject matters that we see, along with some of the most profound attention to humanity, as we see in the case of the wrestler. What we now know, based on radiocarbon, but it's radiocarbon that in fact affirms all of the intuition that early archaeologists of the 20th century who were working on this material, all of the things that they supposed, is that this early art style, the Olmec, is early, and it precedes the Maya. There are archaeological contexts now in which, for example, in Guatemala, at an archaeological site where when they started, this is at Ceibal, a place known for a lot of activity around the year 850 of our era, they dug back layer, 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 and as they got to the very bottom, and they were, by radiocarbon, which requires that something have been burned, something living having been burned, that they were at 800 BC, and they found an Olmec object. It gives us the sense that this is truly the mother culture. This is truly the culture that the Maya were looking back to, thinking, we don't really, it's so deeply past, but we revere it, we take care of it, and as we'll see just now, let me soldier on here, that we're going to, from time to time, yes, okay. So it's not just the ancient people, but modern people also find themselves taking these heirlooms and acting on them. But here's an Olmec jade and it's been cut, pieces taken off it. Perhaps it's been broken. It was never burned, but where there's a Maya series of text here on it as well, as if to say, there's the past, and now it's our present. It was not just the Maya who thought like this, because in fact, at that Aztec capital, as monumental, deep, thorough excavations took place across the 1980s, it was found that the works of the past were systematically gathered up and interred in the Great Temple, as if to say, perhaps something, a visual construct, where people knew that the past was buried inside the present. I guess that's always true, right? The past is always buried inside our present, but in a physical form. And quite extraordinary to find the Teotihuacan mask on the right-hand side of the screen, actually with the inlay that is so rarely survives today. And you can even see that the Olmec head had ties on it, perhaps was reused at some point added to a later mummy bundle of some sort, but with another feature that is so striking about so many Olmec things is the cleft in the head, the idea that it is the concentrated image of the mountain with the cleft, the origin, the place where maize emerges, everything that is life-giving about this precious green material. Okay, so I have a little story to tell you, and I'm going to make sure it works in time. I have to have a sip of water. In 2015, I had looked at the Maximilian Franck album in London, and then over that summer, I spent a few days working at the Museum of Natural History in New York. Why was I working there? I was looking through the archives, and I started by trying to find a particular page of the manuscript, the fourth Maya book, known as the Grolier Codex then, and now the Maya Codex of Mexico today, that Mike Coe told me. Michael Coe, we could talk a little bit more about him, but we probably won't. Michael Coe, one of my teachers and one of my collaborators in working on the Maya Codex, said, Mary, I gave the curator at Natural History, there was a loose page of the Codex when it was here in New York. I put it in one of Sophie's, his wife, shoeboxes, 7 medium, and gave it to Gordon Ekholm. You should go look in his office and see if you can find it. We could have it radiocarbon dated now. So I went to Natural History. I did not find any shoeboxes with 7M, ladies' 7M shoes. But I did find a lot of really interesting correspondence. And it's one of the things that sent me down the rabbit hole of provenance, because I realized there are so many accounts that can be recovered and so many accounts that have been willfully obscured, and where you can recover them, I really had an obligation to do so. So here it is. It's Tuesday, 19 Aug, and you can see that it's from a place called Gwenole, which was the name of the estate of the family of Alistair Bradley Martin. Alistair Bradley Martin he'd had his 15 minutes of fame as a star tennis player in an era of really all amateur tennis players. And he was one of the heirs to the fortune that had been created by Andrew Carnegie early in the 20th and late in the 19th century. He writes this letter, Dear Sir, and a lot of it is written with a little bit of how dare you, and then there's quite a bit of breathless, I need you. So having been very anxious to see you since spring, I'm very disappointed to hear that you're back in the office and you didn't tell me. I would very much like you to examine an object of jade. This spring, I happened to be in Joseph Brummer's gallery, and I saw what he asked me if I would like to see the finest Olmec jade in the world. I said yes. And he went off somewhere. And he returned with the blue-green jade figure in question. I asked him whether it was for sale, and he said no, it was being offered to him, to Brummer, by a dealer, and that it was too expensive. And so this dealer, and I'll now parse a little bit of what I've written out from the letter, a French dealer by the name of Rousset had what Dr. Spindon, the curator at the Brooklyn Museum, an advocate for the understanding of the Olmec that was in circulation but not quite yet confirmed by radiocarbon, and had built an amazing collection at the Brooklyn Museum. So Dr. Spindon said it was the finest Olmec jade known. I was told that Rousset, the French dealer, had come over to New York from Paris, especially to sell this jade to Joseph Brummer. So, who is the biggest and most important shopper of the time? It is not yet Aleister Bradley Martin, and it is definitely not Nelson Rockefeller, who'll come into play a few years later. It is Robert Woods Bliss. And Mr. Bliss makes an offer. He made a substantial offer, and it was refused. So, what happens then? Well, the thing that happens next is that Joseph Brummer drops dead. And he and his brother Ernest were two of the greatest dealers of the works outside the European canon, traditional canon. They sold a lot of medieval. They were very strong in things like Byzantine ivories, some African, a lot of important pre-Columbian objects. So Mr. Rousset left the next day. We're fast forwarding. This is a very long letter. Leaving the jade in the Brooklyn Museum for its safekeeping because Joseph is dead and the Brummer Gallery they didn't buy it. And it's now in a kind of state of chaos. So a few weeks later, really, Dr. Ekholm has been away from New York for a long time as he's finally getting this story. I happened to mention the jade to Ernest Brummer, and he told me the jade was very fine. Everyone keeps saying, the jade is so fine. I need your advice, Dr. Ekholm. I need your advice. Aleister Bradley Martin is about to launch a collection. It's a collection that will never exceed a certain size. When he gets one great object, he often gets rid of others in the category. He has a kind of taste across kind of worldwide, I don't want to call it non-European, but traditions that are not European painting in particular. But in this idea of having a restricted collection of only the very best, why? It's a little bit like the Kimbell. And because it's so great, and now some people have been over at the Brooklyn taking a look at it, and the people are knocking it. People can't resist knocking it. I was interested in finding this expression in a 1947 letter. I hope I haven't bored you with the story of this jade, but please, please, Dr. Ekholm, come look at it with me, please. We do not find any kind of written correspondence from Ekholm in response. But we do know that Aleister Bradley Martin, and he's very worried because he's already made an offer, written it up, sent it over to Rousset in France, because Joseph Brummer's dead, and he's had it accepted. This is a lot of correspondence going on this whole summer. And Dr. Ekholm, now that I bought it, and this word is beginning to get out, I'm really nervous about it. Tell me it's good. Tell me I've made the right choice. Well, we assume that Dr. Ekholm, who was not given to much extravagant waxing about objects, not a Miguel Covarrubias, not a Michael Coe in that respect, that he must have said yes. So as we look at this object, there's the Brooklyn's old picture of it. I just want you to see the way that this human figure, he's lost his leg. I don't think it was broken. I think it was taken. I don't see it as anything accidental. I see it as willful, craven desire to have a piece of this. And that as we see the pressure with which he holds this divine thing in his hands. And we saw that if you don't hold on to them tight, they want to get away from you, these rambunctious little deities. And he holds it the way a number of these other Olmec that's the Kunstachs at Natural History, holding it tight, this baby is like something he is trying to compress. And he holds him tight. And imagine a little cape made of the tiniest bird feathers, maybe wrapping them both. Maybe a little bit of earring. Maybe then wrapped inside some other fine cloth, because if you showed this around too much, someone would want to put it in a pocket and walk off with it to Philadelphia or France or some of the other places that this jade has been. I am so glad that it has found a permanent home here in Fort Worth at the Kimbell Art Museum. Thank you.